I'm ready. Okay, so good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please tell us your name and share anything with us that may help us get to know you a little bit better, please?
Yes, so my name is Matthew Phillips. I am a recent graduate of Duke Law School, where I graduated from a few months ago now, where I graduated with a JD. And before that, I grew up in the Boston area outside of, about 45 minutes outside of Boston, and then went to college at a school up in Maine.
Okay. And so how did you end up in North Carolina at Duke Law?
Yeah, so I had spent pretty much my entire life in New England. So I think I wanted to explore a different part of the country for a little while.
Mhm.
And I thought that law school would be a really good opportunity to do that. I also have two sets of aunts and uncles who live in North Carolina. So I knew that if I moved to Duke and to Durham, I'd at least have family nearby, which would be nice.
Excellent. And how did you find North Carolina? Was it, how similar is it to where you were raised and what you experienced in North Carolina?
Yeah, so I think that it was certainly racially, it had very different demographics. So that was definitely a little bit of a different experience for me. It was also probably the most populated place where I'd ever lived, which Durham is certainly not a huge city or anything like that, but I'd always lived in much smaller towns.
Yeah.
So it was nice to be in a different area. And I think experiencing a little bit of a different culture as well for a while.
Excellent. And what type of law will you practice or do you plan to practice?
So I'm leaning toward litigation broadly. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I tried some corporate classes when I was in law school and some other transactional classes. And I definitely preferred the litigation courses, but I'm hoping to kind of figure out exactly what type of litigation I want to practice over the first few years of actually practicing.
For those who may not understand, what is litigation? What does that term mean?
So I like to think of litigation as what lawyers do on TV shows about practicing law. So litigation is preparing to go into the courtroom and defend a case on behalf of a client. Oftentimes litigators also spend a lot of time preparing for court or trying to keep their clients out of court, or maybe trying to settle a case before a court case actually begins. But I think litigation is always centered around the possibility of actually going into a courtroom and defending your side, either before a jury or before a judge.
And so does that mean you have to choose a side? So like to become a prosecutor or a defense attorney or the other kinds of litigators? Is there a specific thing that you see yourself, or you see litigation falling into that particular discipline?
So I think there definitely are some people who choose a side right away. Like I have friends from law school who definitely came in knowing that they wanted to be a prosecutor and prosecuting criminals, and others on the other side, they wanted to be criminal defense attorneys. I'm hoping to get maybe a mix of that when I start practicing and see kind of what I like the most. I mean, maybe I won't be prosecuting, but if I'm at a private firm, for example, I might be representing both plaintiffs and defendants, so people who are suing other people and people who are being sued by the other side.
Makes perfectly good sense. So when you spoke earlier, you said North Carolina is probably the most diverse place that you've lived in. So what is the area in Massachusetts where you grew up? What is that like in terms of diversity of people, gender, ideas? You know, how do you see that part of the world?
Yeah, so I grew up, as I mentioned, in a suburb of Boston called Acton, Massachusetts. And it was interesting because in some ways it was very diverse, and in some ways it wasn't diverse at all.
Mhm.
The town I grew up in had probably somewhere between 30 and 40% of its population of people of Asian descent. So mainly, I think, immigrants from China and India.
Mhm.
So 30 to 40% of my high school and all of my schools growing up were had minorities in it. So in that way, I think that certainly relative to some of the surrounding towns, it was very diverse.
Mhm.
But that was really, I would say, the only type of diversity in my school system. I went to a relatively large high school with about 2,000 students. And as far as I knew, there was maybe only one or two Black students in the entire school, um, which which is really kind of striking to me when I think about it now. But growing up, I didn't really think much of it because that's just the environment that I'd grown up in.
Right. And so, with that kind of background, coming to North Carolina, where we are, I say significantly more diverse than where you grew up, what was your how did you meet that? So when you came to Duke Law, you were out and about in Durham, and you saw multiple ethnicities. What thoughts went through your head, or how did that resonate with you, if it did?
Right. So between the law school and high school, I went to college up in Maine, and I was at Bates College, which is in Lewiston, Maine. And Bates is a pretty big community of Somali immigrants. So there were Black people in that town, and it was certainly a lot more racially diverse than the town that I'd grown up in. But unfortunately, I think the campus was still not as racially diverse as it probably could have been. And there wasn't a lot of interactions between the people who were at the school at Bates College and the people in the wider community. So I would say that definitely when I went to Durham for law school, that was the first time when I was actually living inside of a community that was much more racially diverse. Um, it was definitely something that was noticeable to me. I don't think that I don't remember thinking of it as a bad thing or a good thing necessarily. It was just something that I noticed. But I do wish that I kind of paid closer attention to that when I did first move into Durham.
So there's a term that's used at many schools to identify ethnicities as affinity groups. Can you tell us what an affinity group is, and why does it have that name? What is the importance of being an affinity group versus just being a Duke Law student or a Bates College student?
Right. So I guess I think of affinity groups as groups of people who are who come from similar backgrounds, and that I would traditionally think of them as kind of almost support groups for people from those backgrounds. And I guess I'd never particularly thought about it this way, but it is interesting to think that those types of support groups are needed at all. But I think that oftentimes affinity groups can be good opportunities for people to meet each other from like backgrounds and meet friends, particularly in environments where there might not be a lot of other people like them, and we're making friends, and we're making friends can be a lot harder for them.
Yeah. Is there any advantage to having people not in that same ethnicity in those affinity groups? So in other words, if we took BALSA, for example, the Black Law Students Association, would it be any value to having the Asian affinity group or the Hispanic affinity group or the women's affinity group or just the general Duke Law student population in those groups?
I think probably, yeah. And I think one thing that I thought was really interesting when we were at Duke Law is that there are oftentimes events where multiple different affinity groups would team up together and maybe combine funds or something like that to be able to bring speakers in and host.
Yeah.
So I think that was a situation in which their affinity groups found that they had common mission or common purpose in the given scenario, and could kind of team up to magnify their impact. So I think that's a good example of that. I think what you were mentioning, you were referring to also was just sort of having allies who maybe are not Black, but joining BALSA anyway to help out with that group or to kind of help drive its mission. And I think that there's certainly a spot for that as well. I do think at the same time, though, that it's up to the people within that group who might identify as coming from a certain background to decide whether that's right for them.
Yeah. So about a month and a couple of weeks now, we saw law enforcement have an incident with a Black man who was lying on the ground, handcuffed, and literally vulnerable. And a white police officer put his knee on his neck and put his hand in his pocket for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. What did you think when you saw that or heard about it?
Yeah, so I remember the first time I saw the video, which I think was either very early June or late May. It was so kind of graphic that I really wanted to look away, because it was horrifying. But I did force myself to watch it because I think it's important that, you know, that's something that actually happened right here in the United States of America.
Right.
Um, and I just remember seeing that same clip played over and over and over again on the news for the next, or really since then, but particularly for the next few weeks after that.
Mhm.
Um, and one thing that was interesting to me was that oftentimes when you see the same image or video over and over again, it kind of loses its impact after a little bit, after a little while. That wasn't my experience this time. I think just because it was so violent and so obviously wrong that it was hard to start looking at it any other way.
Yeah. So as a potential litigator, you on either side of that, what are the two sides of that experience, right? So law enforcement, for example, the person who did this, and a lot of people have classified that as murder, and they're up on charges for types of murder. And then a lot of people have said that obey, don't resist, just obey. You know, as a litigator, where does this fall in the spectrum of law that the everyday person can understand what the two sides of this is? So, you know, the police officer who's paid and encouraged to protect and serve, and the person who is may or may not have committed a crime, and when those two things intersect to result in an outcome like that, where does the law fall in that?
Right. Um, and I don't know if I totally know the answer to that. I think that one of the reasons why the reaction to the George Floyd video was so intense was that it seemed the so-called punishment or the reaction to his actions seemed so out of proportion to anything else that most people had seen. People understand that police officers do have an important job of keeping our communities safe, but I think it's very hard for most people in this country to understand why that type of force was necessary for, I think, 8 to 9 minutes straight to restrain this person. I think there's just a big disconnect there. And if the law does allow that, I think that a lot of people would be right in thinking that maybe the law needs to be changed.
So in looking at society, one of the problems that I have struggled with is, you know, all of a sudden people, specifically white people, have become aware of the injustices that have been heaped on Black and brown communities. Why did this resonate so much with groups that who had normally just didn't consider that to be an issue?
Right. So I think that it's probably a lot of things. I can identify a few. Um, I think one is just the development of technology over the past decade or so. Um, I've been reading a lot of people saying that, you know, this type of thing has been happening in this country for a very, very long time, and certainly not just over the past 10 years. What's different now is that we all have cell phones with cameras in them, and we can record things when this is happening. Um, and I think also just we now know that when we see something wrong that is happening, that we should be recording. I think that was a transition in our thinking as well. Um, but I think over the past, particularly 7 or 8 years now, maybe we've seen videos like this pop up over and over and over again. And I think people have rightly become more and more frustrated by it every single time. So when this video came out, which just seems so incredibly violent, I think to a certain extent, people almost felt like they'd had enough, and that at a certain point, you'd have to start acting to do something about the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing. I think that the pandemic also may have played a role in the reaction that we saw over that we've seen over the past month or so. I think that obviously kind of this era of social distancing is entirely new to all of us. Nobody's really experienced anything like this in their lives before. And particularly throughout the months of March and April and May, a lot of Americans saw their jobs being lost and were worried about their health. There was obviously a racial disparity in who's getting coronavirus and who's dying from coronavirus. And I think that might have contributed to a general sense of powerlessness among a lot of people, just about the circumstances of their lives generally. And I wonder whether that contributed to the kind of the mass outpouring of support for the Black Lives Matter movement after the George Floyd video and some of the other videos came out, just because this is something that people felt like they did have control over and that they could do something about.
That makes a lot of sense. What is your, so I'm going to say 3 words, and I don't know if whether they're all the same word or whether they're synonyms of each other or what, but I want you to tell me what your ideas about that is. What is the difference between white privilege, white power, and white supremacy?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And I don't know if I have if I can provide a fully articulated answer about that. I think that in a lot of white people's minds, there is a difference, in that you can have, a lot of people might think that you can have white privilege but not be a white supremacist. And I certainly think that you can have white privilege and not consciously think or recognize that you're better or superior to Black people in one way or another. But I do think that if you are living in the United States like you are and benefiting from white privilege in some ways, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that is white supremacy, but if you're not doing anything to change that, you are effectively upholding a system that is keeping Black people down, if that makes sense. And so I don't know if that's certainly not the intention of most people, but I think that is where white supremacy might come into play, if that makes any sense at all.
Oh, absolutely. So you led a team on a project, which is how I met you. And I want you to talk a little bit about the project, but I also want you to talk about the diversity of that project and how you were able to fully engage with all of the members of that project and then to come out with the result that you guys did. So please tell us a little bit about the project and see if you can tell me, how you led that group or worked to lead that group with so much diversity in that group.
Yeah, definitely. So Duke has a program called the Vast Connections Program, which aims to bring people from across the university in different schools and different programs together to solve complex global problems. And I think the idea behind that program broadly is that when people approach a problem from different perspectives, they might be able to come up with more creative solutions or just better solutions overall to those problems than if you just had a group of lawyers working on the problem, for example, or you just had a group of engineering students. So it really is an example, I think, of interdisciplinary work, and the idea that type of interdisciplinary work can be more than the sum of its parts, and that when you bring people together with different ideas, you get a better result. So we were working specifically on a team called How Do Cyber Attacks Hurt Us? So we spent the fall semester really researching the problem of cybersecurity issues and data privacy issues in the United States. And we wanted to know exactly how they were affecting everyday Americans like us and our family members, and try to find a solution to see what we could do about it. And one of the things we realized as we were going about that project was that there just wasn't a lot of education in the United States about cybersecurity threats. And so we decided to develop the cybersecurity guide with resources for people about what they can do and what their family members can do to protect themselves online. And we were definitely really happy with our final product that we were able to come up with. But keeping true to the Vast Connections model, it was a very diverse group, both in terms of people from different academic backgrounds. We had economics students and engineering students, and I was a law student on the group, but also in terms of ages and racial backgrounds as well. I was probably the oldest in the group, and then I was in law school, and we had 5 or 6 undergrads in the group as well of different ages. And so it did give me a really exciting opportunity, I think, to help guide the team as much as I could, and kind of to take a role in that team, just because I was a little bit older. I don't think that there were any tensions on the team in terms of like racial tensions or anything like that, particularly because we were at Duke, which I think probably does have a lot of race problems of its own. But I guess in our group we didn't see too much of that. But I think there was we did have to navigate the coming together from different academic backgrounds a little bit more, and just kind of be be more clear than we would have otherwise, but exactly where we were coming from and why we were recommending certain steps that we were. So I think communication was really important throughout that process.
Also, your team leaders, if you were, so we had Governor Raskin, Lou Reiners, myself, and I think we connected to a few other people. Can you talk about what the value of that kind of diverse team was? So Governor Raskin was the former Federal Reserve Chair for Maryland. She also was the Deputy Treasury Secretary under President Obama. Lee Reiners is a fintech guru, and I don't know what I'm a guru at, but I was there too. So can you talk a little bit about that team and how that team affected the outcome of the product that you guys came up with?
Yeah, so I think that was really cool because ordinarily really in any class you have one professor who's teaching the class, and at least in the law school at Duke, I would have 30 to 75 other classmates and just one professor there. But by contrast, in this Fast Connections project that we did, we had probably 6 or 7 student team members and then 4 or 5 faculty team members, which I thought was really exciting because we were able to benefit from all of their diverse experiences as well. And one thing that was interesting was that because the number of professors or faculty leaders and students was almost equal, we kind of all became teammates in a way, as opposed to having 1 or 2 professors really lead or teach the course. We were all learning together, which was an exciting experience to have. And I think really enhanced our overall work product because they were learning right alongside the rest of us.
What did you learn most from that experience?
I think that I learned a lot more about kind of what I want to be doing in my own work and with my career. I really found the collaborative aspect of that work to be rewarding. And that's something that I don't think you automatically get as much of in a career as a lawyer.
Mhm.
I worked at a law firm last summer, and it was a great experience. But every single day, I would go into the office, and I had my own office within the office, and I would just go and pretty much do work individually throughout the course of the day. Maybe stopping by my supervisor's office here and there when I had questions or something like that. So I think that's rewarding in its own way. But I find work where you're working kind of with an entire team throughout the entire process to be more rewarding. And I think that's definitely guided my.
Matt, I think you froze a little bit here.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me, Rochelle?
I can hear you. Just for a little bit there, you were frozen.
Okay. So, yeah, so I was just saying that I think that more than anything, that experience guided what I want to do with the rest of my own career and kind of the people who I'm interested in working with.
Okay, so I only have a couple more questions and I'll allow you the rest of the time, but let me just ask you this question. Where do you stand on race, equality, and injustice? What position do you hold on those 3 places?
Yeah. So you said race, equality, and injustice.
Yes.
So I mean, I think it's more clear to me now than ever before that we as a country are not where we need to be in those 3 areas. As I mentioned, I grew up in a town that was in many ways not very racially diverse. So for so much of my life, those issues just really weren't on my radar.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it was definitely a wake-up call when I moved to college and then subsequently to do law school that these are issues that are issues to begin with, and also things that we need to be dealing with very seriously, kind of as a society. I think over the past few weeks, we've seen some progress in that direction. Um, we've seen, I think it was Missouri get rid of the Confederate flag on their own state flag, and some Confederate monuments going down and things like that. So I think those are all important steps in the right direction, but it's very clear to me that we need to do a lot more on that front, starting with some sort of federal legislation to address things like police reform, which I know some members of Congress are working on. So I think there are things that we need to do as a society. I'm also very aware that there's also a lot that I need to do internally with myself. I never considered myself a racist person by any means, but it's definitely possible and probably more likely or not that I do have racial biases that I just haven't been aware about throughout my entire life, and that I'm probably still not aware about of right now. And so while I might not have that much power over what happens on a federal level necessarily, I think I do have a responsibility to address some of those biases in myself, so that hopefully down the line, if I'm in a position with more power, whether that means I'm in a hiring position, for example, or anything else, that I don't bring those biases along with me.
Yeah. So I will say this, if it's any comfort to you, I was one of your cybersecurity experts, and I would just say every opportunity we had to work together, I never felt uncomfortable around you. I never felt that you saw me any different than you saw Lee or Sarah. I always felt like you saw me just like you saw them. What I brought to the table, I brought to the table, what they brought to the table. And so, I am almost 100% sure we all have biases. Sometimes they're very overt and you know it. You can see it a mile away. And sometimes they're subconscious, that implicit bias versus explicit bias shows up in various ways. But as an older Black woman working with this young law student who was leading this wonderful project, I think the work that you have to do is just know that what exists around us, specifically the Black and Brown communities, has been happening for so long. And a lot of times we don't even know how to process what's happening to us every day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, you cut off a little bit at the end there.
I said, if that makes sense, like we don't always know what's happening to us, because we've got so much we're trying to digest. And the old cliche, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Most times we're having the entire elephant shoved down our throats. We're trying to figure out how do we process what's happening to us. And for me, at least, and I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, at least, white people, this awakening that white people has is astonishing to me, but more importantly, that they are now starting to see and to act and to do and to change. And so if that makes sense to you, when you are again in a diverse environment, if you encounter pieces where it's not particularly comfortable, ask the question, engage
Yeah.
the person, have the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think it's also important to continue this work beyond this moment specifically. Because particularly over the next few months with the presidential election coming up and, God knows what else is going to happen in the next few months, there will probably be stories that distract us and shift efforts or attention to other places. But all of the kind of change we're seeing in this country right now, it is not going to be all the change that we need to be seeing in this country in the next month or so. So I think just continuing to be aware of it is also very important. I mean, it's easier said than done when there are so many things that are vying for our attention. But this is clearly not a problem that's going away, this month, this year, or even probably in the next 10 years. It's probably going to be a lifelong thing that we're dealing with.
I absolutely agree. Thank you very much for that. So you have about 4 minutes. I leave it to you to share anything you want to share with us that we haven't covered or topics that I haven't raised.
Yeah, so I guess one thing that I've just been wondering about is how I can do a better job of supporting my Black friends and my friends who are people of color. Because I do want to be supportive, but I also don't want to kind of be putting a burden on them to be explaining the ways in which, or to be kind of to be lecturing me for teaching me if they don't want to do that, if that makes sense.
It does. I think one of the things that I think is most important about this is relationships, right? So you and I have a relationship. We have a working relationship. We have a peer relationship. And if you can see me as a human being, recognize my intelligence, my abilities, whatever it is, you can engage and have a relationship with me. and the age difference between us is significant. I'm at least 40 years older than you. And to have that kind of relationship with someone and not let it be affected by bias, if you will, to not let it affect you by bias, but then to be comfortable having and saying whatever you need to say. So, for example, one of the people I interviewed said that growing up, the racial slur, the N word, was said a lot in their house. And they didn't find anything wrong with it until much later on. Well, okay, that's great that they acknowledged it, but what do you do about it? So your teammates on your Fast Connection, have you called them and asked them how they are? And I mean all of them, not just the black ones and the brown ones, but all of them. A check-in, so you maintain your relationship with someone. So if you need something, you could email or call me and say, hey Rochelle, I need you to do this for me, because we have a relationship. There's no issue about what color I am or what color you are, where you are in terms of your career, but that you just establish relationships that matter. So, I mean, I'm sure during law school, you made a lot of great white friends who'll be friends for yours for life. That should also be true for black and brown people too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
I think that's a very important point.
Yep. So I think that's it. And I don't think any person, I don't care what color they are, would have problems discussing this uncomfortable conversation. They may be a bit amazed that you're not there already, but I don't think they would hold that against you, because it's like understanding physics, right? So why do particles and atoms and neutrons and all these things, I don't know that, but if somebody asked me to talk about it, I would say as much as I knew, and then I would say this is all the knowledge I have. And so let them go find out whatever they want, because I'm not the only person who might know something about this. There may be another black person, a brown person, or a yellow person, whatever these constructs we create are, that has knowledge. So I don't think anyone would chastise you or feel upset with you if you came to them seeking knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's definitely helpful. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Yep. And I think that young people like you are so important to the world ahead. I think the point that you made earlier, that is probably not going to happen. It's not going to happen immediately. Like you said, things are going to divert our attention, move away. But I think that if we can continually come back to the center of the problem, right? So 1619, slavery. You have the Trail of Tears for the Native Americans, Japanese and Chinese internment camps, all Holocaust, all of these things happen in our world. And I can say for probably most of us, we haven't forgotten that. We know it's there. We've either taught that or we've experienced it. So if you keep coming back to it, no matter how far left or how far right you go, if you come back to the center again and remember these things exist. And I think a well-known philosopher said, if we don't understand our history, we're likely to repeat it. So it's important that we do have people like you that are engaging and establishing relationships across ethnicities and gaining whatever you can from that. Because I think your point you made earlier about the product, it was an amazing product that you guys created. And I mean, the people like myself who's on the outside trying to just help and give advice really did not really impact the project as much as the willingness of your whole team to work together for a common good.
Right. Yeah, I think one other point that I might want to mention before we close is that I think that representation is so important. And that's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently, particularly when it comes to kind of the media that we're consuming and who's creating the media that we're consuming. One thing that I hadn't particularly been aware of before all this happened, but that I have become aware of since, just in reading articles about it, is that the people who write our newspapers, for example, and who put together our nightly newscasts are pretty much overwhelmingly white. And I think that never struck me as a problem before, but that is a problem because it means that these stories that are going into those newscasts and into those newspapers have inherently kind of a white perspective. Probably not intentionally, but those are the people who are deciding what we're told that is most important to us and what we're told that we should be caring about. And so I think that that's another thing that we need to kind of insist on as a society, is making sure that the people who are in charge of our institutions, in particular our media institutions, are representative of all of us. And we're seeing some trends in the right direction on that front at the New York Times and NBC News, but hopefully we'll see more of that in the future.
I think that's very important, but it's going to take people like you to make that happen. You're going to have to, stand up to that and ask, so I'm a CNN junkie, so I watch it almost 24 hours a day. So I see the same thing that you see, but, it's going to take young people to actually raise these issues and address them in a way that makes sense, right? So when you talked about the media, you could go right back to your university. How many Black and brown faculty did you encounter in your 3-year education? It's everywhere. It's not just it's everywhere in our whole society, in our politics, in our education, our everything has a slant to white and mostly male. And as a white male, I think you have a duty to look at that and see why, and see what does it mean to have that broad a spectrum be almost predominantly white and male? What does it mean to the communities that are not represented there?
Right.
Well, Matthew, I certainly appreciate your time, and I'm so glad you were able to do this with me. Where does the booklet stand now? What are we doing with it now? Is it now just in my office and in your home, or is it still being distributed and sent to various agencies?
So we haven't been actively distributing it recently. I know, as you mentioned, you have copies in your office, and I think I've got at least 500 left here with me at my parents' house right now. So hopefully we'll be able to get those distributed as well. One of the things that I'm most proud of with that booklet is that we tried to make it timeless in a sense. Oftentimes with technologies changing so rapidly, you might make a cybersecurity suggestion that is applicable when something's published, but not necessarily applicable several years later because the settings screen of your phone has changed or something like that. We were very intentional about making sure that all of our recommendations in that booklet were easy to understand, were clear, but were also timeless in the sense that they're just as applicable today as they were over a year ago when we finished this project. So certainly, I hope that we can continue to distribute it. And if anyone's watching this and wants a copy, I'd encourage them to reach out to one of us so that we can send them one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Matt. As soon as this video is converted, I'll send you a link to it and you can watch it. I will tell you that your face has been frozen almost the whole time you've been talking.
Okay.
So I hear your voice, but your face has the same inflection that you had when you started the conversation almost. So there's that. If you want to try again, if the way the video and the audio do not align, we can do it again. Or if you're comfortable where it is, we can leave it there too as well.
Okay. Well, thanks, Rochelle. I really am grateful to have had the opportunity to do this.
Absolutely. And as I said to you earlier, as you move about your career, if I can help you, always know where to find me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Stay well. Okay. Bye.